The file was boring. That was the first thing Tarek soon noticed when he opened the annual threat dossier on Sector 7 Null, the portion of the galaxy that every species in the conclave of aligned species had agreed to pretend did not exist. He sat in his tiny analyst cubicle on Station Oriya, surrounded by the quiet hum of 400 other intelligence workers, all doing the same thing he was doing. Sorting data, flagging anomalies, writing reports that no one with any real power would ever read, and he stared at a file so thin it could have been a mistake. Sector 7 Null. Human-controlled space. Everyone called it the Silence. His assignment was simple, or at least his supervisor, Liaison Commander Orith, had made it sound simple when she dropped the task on his desk that morning with all the enthusiasm of someone handing over a parking violation. Annual review, she had said, not even looking at him. Compile the dossier, flag anything new, submit by. End of cycle. Tarek had nodded like a good junior analyst and opened the file expecting the usual. Territorial scans, diplomatic status updates, communication intercepts. Instead, he found almost nothing. The Silence had no diplomatic status because humanity had not spoken to the Conclave in over 3,000 years. There were no communication intercepts because no signals came out of human space. There were no territorial scans because every probe sent toward the boundary of Sector 7 Null had gone dark the moment it crossed an invisible line in the void. Tarek leaned back in his chair, his mandibles clicking softly, the way they always did when something didn't sit right in his head, a habit his clutchmates had mocked him for since childhood. He pulled the historical records. This was where boring became something else entirely. 347 ships had entered human space over the last galactic cycle. Number again. 347. Military probes from the Draelith Empire, science vessels from the Suri Collective, pirate raiders from a dozen unaffiliated species, trade ships that miscalculated jumps, refugee convoys that overshot their navigation corridors, and one. Tarek had to read this entry 3 times. One fully armed conclave dreadnought carrying 14,000 crew that had been sent on what the records called a diplomatic enforcement mission roughly 800 years ago. Every single one was gone, not destroyed. That was the part that made Tarek's mandibles go still. There were no debris fields, no energy signatures consistent with weapons fire, no radiation traces, no distress beacons, no final transmissions, no bodies, no wreckage, no evidence of violence of any kind. The ships had not been attacked. They had not been captured, because no ransom demands had ever come, no prisoner exchanges had ever been proposed, no species had ever received so much as a single returned crew member. The ships crossed the boundary and ceased to exist in every way that the Conclave could measure. Tarek pulled up the tracking data, because every ship in Conclave space carried quantum-linked transponders that could not be jammed, could not be spoofed, and could not be destroyed without generating a specific energy burst that sensors would detect from 3 systems away. The transponders had not been destroyed. They had simply stopped transmitting, as if the quantum link itself, a thing that operated outside normal spacetime, a thing that the brightest minds in the Conclave said could not be severed by any known technology, had been switched off. Tarek sat very still in his chair for a long time. Then he began writing his report. He was thorough, because that was who he was, a Vialathi analyst who believed that data was the only honest thing in a galaxy full of politicians and predators. He compiled every entry, every lost ship, every failed probe, every vanished transponder signal. He mapped the timeline and found something that made the air in his cubicle feel thin. The disappearances were not random. They were evenly distributed across the entire boundary of human space, a boundary that stretched across 4,000 light-years of territory, which meant that whatever was taking these ships was not stationed at a single point. It was everywhere. The entire boundary was active, all of it, every invisible inch, and it had been active without interruption for over 3,000 years. Tarek flagged the report as Priority Sigma, the highest classification his clearance allowed, and submitted it through the secure channel directly to Oreth's office. 20 minutes later, his door opened. Oreth stood in the frame, and she was a different person than the one who had handed him the assignment that morning. She stepped inside. She closed the door. She locked it. And Tarek watched the most decorated intelligence officer in the Vialathi service, a woman who had survived 3 border wars, 2 assassination attempts, and the political nightmare of the Conclave's inner council for over 40 years, press her back against the door and fold her arms across her chest in a way that was not authority. It was containment. She was holding herself together. "Delete the file," she said. Her voice was flat and careful, in the way voices become when the person speaking has practiced the sentence many times. Tarek stared at her. "Commander, the data shows—" "I know what the data shows. 347 ships, Commander, and not a single—" "I said I know." The room got very small. Oreth's hands were trembling, a fine, rapid vibration that she was clearly aware of because she pressed them harder against her own arms, and Tarek realized with a sensation like ice water filling his thorax that she was not surprised by his findings. She was not alarmed by them. She was not even angry that he had flagged them at Priority Sigma. She was afraid, and she had been afraid for a very long time. "Everyone knows," Tarek said, and it was not a question. Oreth looked at him the way old soldiers look at recruits who have just seen their first body. "Delete the file, Tarek." She unlocked the door and left. Tarek sat alone in his cubicle as the station hummed around him, and 400 analysts on the other side of the wall sorted their harmless data about harmless sectors that made sense in a galaxy that followed rules. He did not delete the file. He copied it to a personal drive, encrypted it with a key only he knew, and slid the drive into the inner pocket of his uniform, where it sat against his chest like a second heartbeat. Oldest archive he could access. The deep records that no one browsed because they were 4,000 years out of date and written in languages the translation software handled poorly. He searched for the last known communication from humanity. It took him 2 hours. He found it buried in a subfile labeled Historical, No Active Relevance, and he wanted to laugh at that label. He wanted to laugh until his mandibles ached, because the message was 300 years old, and it was the most actively relevant thing he had ever read. It was a fragment, a single intercepted transmission broadcast on a frequency the Conclave no longer monitored, and it had been received by a listening post that had since been decommissioned. The translation was rough but clear. "Boundary protocol active. Welcome home." Tarek read it 7 times. Then he closed the archive, turned off his terminal, and sat in the dark of his cubicle with his hand pressed against the drive in his pocket, and the weight of 347 ships pressing against the inside of his skull. The silence was not empty. It had never been empty. And somewhere behind that invisible line in the void, something was waiting with the patience of a species that had learned exactly what the galaxy was capable of, and had decided, quietly, totally, and without negotiation, that it would never be a victim again. The conclave chamber was built to make every species feel small. It worked. Tarek stood in the observer gallery 3 tiers above the main floor, and watched 142 delegations arrange themselves in the vast circular hall, like insects finding their places on a carcass. Each one jostling for position, each one pretending they were not jostling at all. He had not slept in 4 days. The encrypted drive was still in his pocket, and his mind was still circling the same question, like a creature trapped in a drain. If everyone already knew about the silence, if every senior officer and diplomat and intelligence chief in the conclave understood that ships went in and never came out, then why was there no plan, no strategy, No response of any kind. The answer walked into the chamber, wearing the black and gold armor of the Dralith Empire, and carrying himself like a blade someone had forgotten to sheathe. War Admiral Voss Kaidan. Tarek had read his file on the shuttle ride to the Conclave station, and the file read like a monument someone had built to their own teeth. 30 years of service, 11 major engagements, 0 defeats, a reputation for the kind of decisive violence that made enemy fleets change course when they detected his transponder. He was tall even by Dralith standards, broad across the shoulders in a way that made the armor look like it was struggling to contain him. And he moved through the chamber with the absolute certainty of a creature who had never once been the smaller thing in any room. He took the speaker's platform without being invited, and the chamber fell into the particular kind of silence that happens when everyone present knows they are about to hear something dangerous. 3,000 years, Kaidan said, and his voice filled the room the way a rock fills a pond, by displacing everything else. 3,000 years this body has allowed a single species to occupy a territory larger than the combined holdings of the 12 founding members of this conclave, a territory rich in resources and strategic value beyond calculation. And in all that time, not one of you has done a single meaningful thing about it. Murmuring from the delegations, the sound of 100 species being offended simultaneously, a sound like gravel shifting in a bag. Kaidan ignored it. I am here to file a formal territorial grievance under Section 4 of the Aligned Species Charter, and to request authorization for a diplomatic fleet, armed and shielded, to enter Sector 7 Null and establish contact with the human civilization by any means necessary. The murmuring stopped. What replaced it was worse. Tarek watched the faces of the delegates below and saw something he had never seen in the conclave before. Not during trade disputes or border conflicts or even the assassination of the Velmari ambassador 6 years ago. He saw recognition. Not surprise, not alarm. Recognition. The look of people watching a thing they always knew would happen finally arrive at their door. Kaidan continued speaking, laying out strategic arguments and resource projections, and Tarek stopped listening because he had opened his personal terminal and was digging into the archives again, deeper this time, past the intelligence reports and into the historical records that predated the conclave itself. He found what he was looking for, in a file so old it was stored in a format his terminal could barely read. The Cooperative Era. 4,000 years ago, humanity had been new to the galactic stage, a young species fresh from their first interstellar flights, grinning and eager, and so pathologically social that they had attempted to learn the greeting customs of every species they encountered, all 90 of them at the time. They joined the proto-conclave within a decade of first contact. They shared their technology freely, offered their homeworld as a neutral meeting ground for disputes. They volunteered their soldiers for joint peacekeeping missions with a cheerful willingness that other species found either admirable or suspicious, depending on their own capacity for trust. Tarek scrolled through the records and felt something cold settle behind his eyes. The Pyrrhic expansion wars came next, a series of resource conflicts between the 6 most powerful species of the era. And Earth, humanity's homeworld, was used as a staging ground because it sat at a convenient navigational crossroads, and because the humans had said yes when asked. Because the humans always said yes. The wars lasted 200 years. Earth was irradiated, its oceans poisoned, its atmosphere scarred with chemicals that would take millennia to clear. When the wars ended, the humans asked for help rebuilding. The 6 species who had used their world as a battlefield held a vote. The vote was not about rebuilding. The word in the old records was dispersal. Tarek read the transcript of that vote, and his mandibles locked together so hard he tasted copper. Dispersal meant scattering, the forced relocation of an entire species across 100 marginal colony worlds, planets with toxic atmospheres, unstable geology, insufficient resources, planets where survival was technically possible, but prosperity was not. The justification in the transcript was written in the bland, careful language of bureaucrats who know they are doing something monstrous, and have decided to do it in passive voice. The human species, having demonstrated an inability to maintain territorial integrity and a pattern of excessive social dependency on host civilizations, is to be redistributed across designated settlement zones for the purpose of reducing strategic concentration and promoting independent development. They scattered them like seeds across dead soil and called it policy. Tarek closed the file. He looked down at the chamber where Caden was still speaking, still demanding action, still radiating the confidence of a species that had never been dispersed. And Tarek wanted to stand up and scream at every delegate in that room. He did not scream. He was a Vialathi analyst, and Vialathi analysts do not scream. They compile data and flag anomalies. And so he sat with his hands flat on his knees and his mandibles aching, and he watched what happened next. The elder delegate from the Suri collective rose to speak. His name was Valen, and he was ancient, his skin the color of old stone, his movements carrying the careful deliberation of a body that had been alive for a very long time and knew the cost of every motion. The chamber went quiet again, but differently this time, because Valen was old enough that some of the delegates recognized what he was. Not just a politician, but a witness, a living remnant of the generation that had been in power when the boundary appeared. I was there, Valen said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried in the way that voices carry when every person in the room is holding their breath. I was a junior member of the Suwuri delegation when the boundary appeared, and I want to tell you what the humans said before they stopped talking to us forever. Caden stood at the speaker's platform with his arms folded, and his expression suggesting he considered this interruption a personal insult. Valen did not look at him. 300 years after the dispersal, we received a transmission from the region of space that would become Sector 7 null. A single broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, and it was not a threat, it was not a declaration of war, it was not a demand for reparations or an announcement of military capability. He paused. The chamber was so silent, Tarek could hear the ventilation system cycling 3 floors above. It was one sentence, Valen said. We understand now. He sat down. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one could find, and Tarek felt them settle into his chest next to the encrypted drive, heavy and precise. And he understood, with a clarity that hurt, that the sentence was the worst thing any species had ever said to another. Not because it was angry, because it was finished. The humans had looked at the galaxy and everything it had done to them, and they had not raged or threatened or mourned. They had understood. They had understood what the galaxy was, what it valued, what it would do to kindness. And they had taken that understanding and turned it into a wall that no one could cross and come back from. Caden's fleet launched 12 days later. 412 ships, the finest the Dralith had ever built, loaded with enough firepower to reduce a solar system to debris, crewed by soldiers who had never lost a war, and could not imagine a universe in which losing was something that happened to them. Tarek was aboard the flagship as an official conclave observer, a role that carried no authority and existed entirely so the conclave could later claim they had tried to maintain oversight. Orith had pulled him aside before departure in a corridor with no surveillance equipment, a corridor she had clearly chosen in advance, and she had gripped his arm hard enough to dent his chitin. "Find out what is on the other side," she said, "and come back alive." She did not say if you can. She did not need to. Tarek watched Station Oriya shrink in the viewport as the fleet accelerated toward the boundary of Sector 7 Null, and he pressed his hand against the drive in his pocket, and he thought about 347 ships that had made this same journey, and not one of them had ever sent a single word back. The stars ahead looked the same as the stars behind. That was the part that scared him most. There was no visible edge to the silence. You could cross it without knowing. And by the time you realized where you were already somewhere that the rest of the galaxy could not reach. The fleet moved in perfect formation for 11 days, and Tarek spent every one of those days watching Caden's crew perform confidence, the way actors perform roles they have rehearsed so many times. The fear underneath has become invisible. Weapons drills at 0600. Strategic briefings at 0900. Officers laughing too loud in the mess hall, telling stories of previous campaigns, with the aggressive enthusiasm of people trying to fill a silence they can all hear, but no one will name. Tarek sat in the observer section of the flagship bridge and compiled his notes and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to 14,000 Drelith soldiers who believed they were sailing toward a diplomatic mission, and not toward the same invisible line that had swallowed 347 ships without leaving a scratch. On the 12th day the navigator frowned. It was a small frown, the kind that appears when a person looks at a number they trust, and the number disagrees with. "Admiral," the navigator said, "star positioning is showing a deviation of 0.3% from projected coordinates." Caden glanced at the display the way a predator glances at a sound that might be prey and might be nothing. "Recalibrate," he said. "I have, sir." "Then recalibrate again." The navigator recalibrated, and the deviation increased to 0.7%, and then to 1.4. And then the navigator stopped reporting numbers and simply stared at the screen with an expression that Tarek recognized because he had seen it in his own reflection 4 days earlier in his cubicle on Station Oriya. It was the expression of a person whose instruments are telling them something their training says is impossible. "Admiral, the star charts are no longer matching known configurations." Caden walked to the navigation console and looked at the display, and for the first time since Tarek had boarded this ship, saw the Admiral's jaw tighten. The stars were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not reshuffled into alien patterns, but subtly wrong. A fraction of a degree here, a brightness variation there, as if someone had taken the familiar sky and nudged it the way you might adjust a painting on a wall, just enough that the viewer knows something has changed but cannot point to what. "Engine status," Caden said. "Full forward thrust confirmed, sir." "Navigation, confirm our velocity and heading." "That is the problem, Admiral. Navigation says we are stationary." "We cannot be stationary if the engines are at full thrust." "Yes, sir, I am aware of that, sir." The bridge crew exchanged glances, and Tarek gripped the edge of his seat, because he understood what was happening, even if no one else was ready to say it. They were already inside. There had been no flash, no barrier, no alarm, no moment of crossing. You walked through. It was a room you were already standing in by the time you thought to look for the entrance. Caden ordered a fleet-wide status check, and the reports came back wrong in 412 different ways. Ship-to-ship timestamps were out of sync by anywhere from 3 seconds to 11 minutes, which should have been impossible, because every vessel in the fleet was linked by quantum-synchronized chronometers that could not drift. Sensor arrays on the portside destroyers were detecting gravitational signatures from planets that did not appear on any map. The medical bay on the frigate Kale's Fist had activated without authorization and was synthesizing atmospheric compounds that no one had requested and that matched no known Drelith pharmaceutical formula. And across the fleet, on every ship simultaneously, the AI navigation systems began running translation protocols for a language none of them had been programmed to recognize. Hold up, the flagship's AI interface. "What are you translating?" he asked. The AI responded in Vialathi, which it should have not known, because Tarek had been speaking conclave standard. "Preparing for intake." Tarek stared at the words on his screen. "Whose intake?" "Yours." Caden was barking orders, demanding weapons checks, calling for shield reinforcement, doing all the things a career military commander does when the situation stops making sense and training becomes the only solid ground left. Then every viewport on every ship in the fleet filled with something that was not a star, and not a planet, and not a station. Structures, massive beyond any architecture Tarek had ever seen or imagined, hanging in the void like thoughts that had been given bones. Shapes that curved in ways that suggested they were not built from the outside in, but grown from the inside out. As if someone had taken an idea and kept feeding it material, until it became a place. They were everywhere, not clustered around a star the way stations cluster, not arranged in the orbital patterns that every spacefaring species used, but distributed across the visible space in a configuration that obeyed no gravitational or economic logic Tarek could identify. They were arranged by something else, some principle he did not have a word for. "What are those?" Caden said, and his voice had changed. Not afraid, not yet, but stripped, the performance of authority briefly interrupted by genuine incomprehension. "Unknown structures, Admiral. Materials analysis is not returning results." "What do you mean, not returning results?" "I mean the scanners are detecting the structures, but cannot determine what they are made of. The composition readings are returning values that do not correspond to any known element or compound." Caden turned to his weapons officer. "Structure, full battery. Fire on my command." "Targeting now, Admiral." A pause. "Admiral, weapons are not responding." "Repeat that." "Weapon systems are offline, sir. Not damaged, not jammed. The diagnostic says they are simply not active, as if they were never installed." Caden's hands went to the console, and Tarek watched him try to access the weapons grid manually. And the console responded to every command, except the ones that involved hurting something. It was not a malfunction, it was a curation. Something had reached into every ship in the fleet, into every weapon system, every torpedo tube, every energy cannon, and had simply removed the concept of violence from the hardware. Not destroyed it, that would leave damage signatures. Removed it the way you remove a word from a sentence, and the sentence still reads correctly, with a different meaning. The fleet was 412 warships, and not a single one of them could scratch paint. A ship appeared. Small, smaller than the smallest shuttle in the Dralith fleet. Unarmed in a way that was not vulnerability, but statement. The way a god might walk naked into a room full of armed soldiers. Not because it cannot find armor, but because armor would be absurd. It approached the flagship at a speed that should have triggered proximity alarms, but triggered nothing, because the alarms had apparently decided this visitor was not a threat. And Tarek thought that the alarms were either broken or smarter than everyone on the bridge. The ship broadcast on every frequency, in every language spoken by every species in the conclave, simultaneously, and the voice was warm and calm and female, and carried the particular weight of someone who is not making a request. "You are now inside human-administered space." The bridge went silent in a way Tarek had not known silence could go. A silence that had texture and mass, settled on every person present, like a hand placed gently on the top of the head. Boundary protocol is active. Weaponry has been disabled. Propulsion has been limited. Biological needs will be met. You will be processed. Resistance is noted, but will not be acted upon. You are safe. You are not leaving. Caden stood at the center of his bridge, surrounded by the finest military technology the Dralith Empire had ever produced, and none of it mattered, and he knew it. Tarek looked out the starboard viewport because something had caught his eye, a pattern in the distance, and he walked to the glass and pressed his face close enough that his mandibles touched the cold surface. On the surface of a planetoid below the fleet, arranged in rows so neat they could have been drawn with a ruler, sat hundreds of ships. Thousands. Every design Tarek had ever studied, and dozens he had not. Dralith cruisers, and Suri research vessels, and pirate raiders, and bulk freighters, and one ancient conclave dreadnought, with a hull configuration that matched records from 800 years ago. Every ship that had ever crossed the boundary, intact. Not wreckage, not trophies, not salvage. Parked, as if their crews had simply landed them, stepped out, and walked away into whatever world the humans had built behind this impossible curtain. Kaidan had not moved from the center of the bridge, and Tarek realized the Admiral was not frozen with fear. He was frozen with the far more dangerous sensation of a man who has built his entire identity on being the most powerful thing in any room, and has just discovered that the room he is standing in does not recognize the concept. The warm voice spoke again. "A representative will arrive shortly. Please do not be afraid. That is not what this is." Tarek looked at the parked ships on the planetoid below, and counted rows until the numbers stopped meaning anything. Understood, with a certainty that went deeper than data and deeper than analysis, that he was looking at proof, not proof of power, proof of patience. Whatever the humans had become, they had been becoming it for 3,000 years, and they had not hurried, and they had not announced it, and they had not threatened anyone with it. They had simply left the door open and waited for the galaxy to walk through. The shuttle docked with the flagship without requesting permission and without triggering a single security protocol, as if the ship itself had decided this visitor was expected. Kaidan ordered a full-armed escort to the docking bay, and then stood in the corridor outside the bay doors, looking at the weapons his soldiers carried, and knowing they were decorative. Tarek followed 3 steps behind, because no one had told him not to, and because his mandate as an observer technically permitted him to be anywhere on the ship, a technicality he was exploiting with the desperate creativity of someone who knows they are witnessing the most important event in galactic history, and cannot afford to miss it because they were standing in the wrong hallway. The docking bay doors opened. A woman walked out. She was not what Tarek had expected, though he realized as soon as he thought that he had no idea what he had expected. A machine, perhaps, or a giant, or a being wrapped in technology so advanced it would look like sorcery. She was none of those things. She was medium height, with brown hair cut to her shoulders, and a face that carried the kind of easy warmth that made you think of someone pouring tea in a kitchen with sunlight coming through the windows. She wore simple clothing, dark fabric, no insignia, no armor, nothing that signaled rank or authority or threat. She smiled at the armed Dralith soldiers, the way a person smiles at children holding toy swords. "Hello," she said. "My name is Marin. I am here to talk." Kaidan stepped forward, and he was nearly twice her height and 4 times her mass, and armed with the kind of combat training that could end most biological encounters in under 3 seconds. He looked down at her. She looked up at him with an expression of genuine pleasant interest, the way a person looks at a new neighbor they are happy to meet. "You have disabled my fleet," Kaidan said. "Yes. You have trapped 412 ships and over 80,000 crew members inside your territory." "Yes, though trapped is not the word I would use." "What word would you use?" "Welcomed." A muscle in Kaidan's jaw twitched, and Tarek had seen that twitch in archive footage of the Admiral's previous engagements, and it usually preceded someone's fleet being reduced to expanding clouds of superheated metal. "You will restore our weapon systems and allow us to leave," Kaidan said. Marin tilted her head the way a person tilts their head when they hear something confusing but not upsetting. "No," she said. She said it without aggression, without challenge, without any of the emotional weight that the word no usually carries when spoken to a war admiral who has never heard it before. She said it the way gravity says no to a thrown ball, not as a choice, but as a condition of the environment. "But I would like to sit down and explain some things," if you have time. We are your prisoners. We have nothing but time. You are not prisoners, Admiral. That is one of the things I would like to explain. They sat in the flagship's conference room. Kaidan, his 4 senior officers, Tarek in his observer capacity, and Marin, who accepted a chair and a glass of water, and looked around the room with the quiet appreciation of someone visiting a museum. She began talking, and Tarek realized within the first 30 seconds that he was going to have to revise everything he thought he knew about humanity. And within the first 5 minutes, he realized he was going to have to revise everything he thought he knew about civilization. After the dispersal, Marin said, humanity had been scattered across 100 colony worlds that were barely capable of sustaining life. Most species, she said, would have died. Some would have survived at subsistence level. Humans did something. We are a species that bonds, she said, and the word bonds in her mouth carried a weight that went beyond its dictionary definition, a weight that suggested centuries of that single verb being tested against every form of cruelty the galaxy could produce. Scatter us and we find each other. Break our groups and we form new ones. Put us on a dying world and we will build a community in the ruins before we build a shelter. Because for us, community is the shelter. The scattered colonies reconnected within 2 generations, not through technology, but through sheer biological stubbornness. Humans on one toxic world figuring out how to send messages to humans on another toxic world, using equipment built from salvage and powered by rage, and the absolute refusal to be alone. Within 4 generations they had a network. Within 6, they had a civilization again. But it was not the civilization they had been before. Before the dispersal we were builders, Marin said. We built outward. Ships, stations, trade routes. We built things to connect us to the galaxy because we believed the galaxy wanted to be connected to us. She paused, and the pause was not dramatic. It was simply a person letting a memory pass through them, the way weather passes through an open window. After the dispersal, we built inward. She explained what inward meant, and the room got very quiet. Humans cracked post-scarcity within 3 centuries of the dispersal, not because they were geniuses, but because scarcity was killing them. And humans under existential pressure do not innovate politely. They innovate the way a trapped animal digs, with everything they have, and no concern for what the digging looks like. Post-scarcity was just the beginning. They developed programmable matter, physical material that could be restructured at the atomic level by thought. They developed space-time topology, the ability to fold, stretch, and reshape the fabric of space itself within a controlled region. They developed consciousness architecture, the ability to link individual human minds into networks that preserved each person's identity, while giving them access to the processing power of billions. 12 billion humans live inside this space, Marin said, and each of them is, by the standards you would use, a civilization. Kaidan had not spoken in several minutes, and Tarek could see the Admiral processing this information the way a machine processes data that exceeds its design parameters, functional, but strained. The structures we saw, Tarek said, speaking for the first time, the ones that do not match any known materials. Marin looked at him with an expression of surprised warmth, as if she had not expected the quiet analyst to be the first one to connect the pieces. Thought spaces, she said. Physical manifestations of shared consciousness. Humans think together with enough coherence, the thought becomes a place. It is not metaphor, it is engineering. That is not possible, one of Kaidan's officers said. You are sitting inside the proof that it is, Marin said, and she said it gently, the way a teacher corrects a student she likes. She explained the boundary. It was not a wall, and it was not a weapon, and it was not a shield. It was a filter, a region of restructured spacetime that scanned everything passing through it at a level so deep that the scan read molecular structure, energy signatures, neurological patterns, and intent. Intent, Kaidan repeated. We mapped the neurochemistry of aggression across every species the Conclave contains, Marin said. "We can read hostile intent, the way you read a ship's transponder. It is not telepathy, it is chemistry, and we are very good at chemistry." "And the ships that crossed," Tarek said, "the 347 ships, were given a choice," Marin said. "Stay here and live in a place where your species' needs are met completely. Food, shelter, purpose, community, health, lifespan extension, or leave, with full knowledge of what we have become, and return to the galaxy." The room was so quiet that Tarek could hear the hum of the flagship's life support 3 decks away. "Every crew chose to stay," Marin said. Caden leaned forward. "Why?" he said, and the word came out with an edge that was not anger, but something rawer and less controlled. Something that sounded like a man who has just been told that everything he conquered was not worth having. "Why not come back? Why not rejoin the galaxy? You could rule it." Marin's warmth did not fade, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something old and deep and tired, in a way that was not fatigue, but completion. The tiredness of a species that had finished grieving, and built something out of the silence that came. "We already know what the galaxy does with kindness," she said. She let the words sit. "We offered it once. The answer was dispersal." Caden did not look away from her, and Tarek watched the Admiral's face do something he had never seen it do in any archive footage or briefing recording or combat report. It softened. Not into weakness, into recognition, the expression of a creature encountering something it did not believe existed, and finding that the encounter was not a threat, but an ache. "So we built a place where kindness is the architecture," Marin said, "and we left the door open. One way. Anyone who walks in stays, not because we trap them, but because once you have seen what we built, the galaxy out there feels like a fire with no warmth." Tarek sat in his chair and realized his hands were shaking, and he pressed them flat on the table to stop the trembling, and it did not stop. 9 hours. Inside human space for 9 hours. And the feeling that was flooding through his thorax and up into his skull was not fear and not awe, and not the overwhelming vertigo of encountering technology beyond comprehension. It was relief. The relief of a creature that had been swimming in cold water for so long it had forgotten that warmth was a thing that existed. And then someone had pulled it out and wrapped it in something soft. And the worst part, the part that made his mandibles lock and his vision blur, was that the feeling was not manufactured, not engineered, not a trick of the consciousness architecture, or the programmable matter, or the space-time topology. It was just a place where someone had decided to be kind, and had possessed the power to make that kindness structural. Tarek looked at Marin, and she looked back at him, and she smiled the way a person smiles at someone who has just come home after a very long journey. Mission was over. Not because he had failed, because Orith's order, find out what is on the other side and come back alive, contained an assumption that no longer held. The assumption that anyone who found out would want to come back. 6 weeks passed inside the silence, and Tarek stopped counting days because time inside human space did not behave the way time behaved anywhere else, and because counting felt like holding onto a rope attached to a building that was no longer there. Caden's fleet sat on the planetoid's surface alongside every other ship that had ever crossed the boundary. 412 Dralith warships parked in neat rows next to pirate skiffs and science vessels, and that ancient dreadnought whose crew had been living inside human space for 800 years, and who, according to the records Tarek was given access to, had never once asked to leave. The crews were not confined. That was the thing Tarek kept returning to in his notes, the thing he circled and underlined and could not stop thinking about, because it broke every model of captivity and conquest that the Conclave had ever built. The crews went wherever they wanted. They were given quarters that adjusted to their species, biological needs automatically. Temperature, atmosphere, gravity, light spectrum, and they were given food that was not replicated or synthesized, but grown in environments designed specifically for each species' nutritional requirements. They were given access to human settlements, or whatever the correct word was, for the thought spaces that served as communities inside this territory. And the humans in those spaces greeted them with the casual friendliness of neighbors who had been expecting company. Tarek walked through a human thought space on his third week, and could not write his report afterward because his hands would not stop shaking. It was not a city. It was not a station. It was a place in the way that the word place meant something before architecture reduced it to walls and ceilings. It was an environment shaped by the collective intention of the minds that inhabited it, and it shifted in real time as those minds thought, felt, and dreamed. Walls becoming gardens, becoming libraries, becoming open sky, becoming walls again. Not chaotically, but with the fluid coherence of a conversation between people who understand each other completely. There were children, human children running and laughing and playing in spaces that reconfigured around their games, like a parent kneeling to meet a child's eyes. And Tarek watched a small girl chase a small boy through a corridor that curved itself into a spiral slide as they ran, and then straightened into a bridge over a pond that had not existed 3 seconds earlier. And the children shrieked with joy, and the sound hit Tarek somewhere behind his sternum with a force that had nothing to do with volume. These were not conquerors. These were not the remnants of a scattered and broken species nursing a grudge across millennia. These were people who had taken every terrible thing the galaxy had done to them and composted it into soil and grown something so alive it made the rest of the galaxy look like a photograph of a place where living things used to be. He found Caden on the 4th week. The Admiral was sitting alone in a garden, a real garden, with actual soil and actual plants, maintained by hand, in a place where programmable matter could have done the work in seconds, and he was not wearing his armor. Tarek had never seen a Dralith warrior without armor in a non-private setting, and the sight was so disorienting that he stood at the garden's edge for a full minute before Caden noticed him. "Analyst," Caden said. "Admiral, sit down." Tarek sat. Caden's hands were in the dirt, and Tarek realized the Admiral was planting something, a small green shoot that he was pressing into the soil with fingers that had commanded fleets and ended civilizations, fingers that were now covered in earth and moving with a care that Tarek had never seen in any military context. "Showed me how," Caden said, answering a question Tarek had not asked. She said it was called gardening, and that humans used to do it before they could reshape matter with their thoughts, and that some of them still do it because the point was never the efficiency. He pressed the soil around the shoot and looked at it the way a person looks at something they do not fully understand but have decided to trust. "She asked me about Dralith music," he said. "What?" "The human, Marin. She asked me about Dralith music. She said she had heard recordings, but wanted someone to explain the emotional grammar of it, the way the tonal shifts work, and what the silences between movements are supposed to make the listener feel." Caden looked at Tarek, and his face was the face of a man who has had a wall inside himself removed, and is still adjusting to the space where it used to be. "I talked for 4 hours, he said. 4 hours about music, about the way the third movement's silence, in the Kale variations, is supposed to evoke the feeling of standing in a field after a storm. And she listened. She listened the way no one in my entire career has ever listened to anything I have said." He turned back to his plant. "No one has ever asked me about something that mattered to me," he said. "In 30 years of service, no one has ever asked me what I care about when I am not commanding a fleet." Tarek sat in the garden and watched the most dangerous military officer in the Dralith Empire tend a seedling with dirty hands, and he did not write this in his report, because some things are not data, they are just true. 6 weeks after the fleet's departure, the conclave convened an emergency session. Orith chaired it because someone had to, and because she had known this moment would come, since the day she locked her office door and told a young analyst to delete a file he had no intention of deleting. Was full. And the mood was the particular flavor of panic that institutions produce when confronted with a problem they created and cannot solve. Urgent, loud, and aimed in every direction except inward. Delegates demanded a rescue fleet. Delegates demanded a declaration of war. Delegates demanded the construction of a weapon capable of breaching the boundary, a proposal that was technically meaningless since no one in the conclave understood what the boundary was made of or how it worked. Valen, the elder Suri delegate, rose again. He was carrying a data tablet, and he set it on the speaker's platform and activated it. And the chamber's holographic display filled with Tarek's original report. Every data point, every vanished ship, every historical record of the dispersal, every piece of evidence that a junior analyst had compiled in a cubicle, and that an entire civilization had spent 3,000 years trying not to look at. Valen said, and this is what it became. The chamber looked at the data, and the data looked back, and for the first time in its history, the conclave of aligned species sat in the presence of a truth that could not be voted on, amended, tabled, or referred to committee. They had scattered a kind species across 100 dying worlds, and that species had not died, and had not come back for revenge, and had instead built a paradise, and left the door open. And the door was the most terrifying thing in the galaxy, because it was not a threat. It was an invitation. And every soul who accepted it chose to stay. The session lasted 9 hours and produced 3 votes. The motion to send a rescue fleet failed, because every military analyst in the chamber knew that sending more ships into the silence would simply mean more ships that never came back. The motion to officially recognize human space as sovereign failed, acknowledging what humanity had become, and no species in the conclave was ready to look directly at that sun. The motion that passed was small and quiet and bureaucratic, and it was the most honest thing the conclave had done in 3,000 years. They voted to update the navigational warnings for Sector 7 null. The old warning read, Sector 7 null, restricted, transit prohibited by conclave order. The new warning read, Sector 7 null, human-administered space, unauthorized entry means one thing, no one ever comes back. They framed it as a deterrent. They told themselves it was a warning to keep their people safe, to keep ships away from the danger that lurked beyond that invisible line. Tarek read the new warning on a display inside the human thought space where he had been given a home, a space that shifted and breathed around him like a living thing, a place where his biological needs were met so completely that he had forgotten what hunger felt like, and where the people around him, human and alien alike, treated him with a kindness so consistent it had stopped feeling remarkable and started feeling like weather. He smiled. The conclave thought they were protecting the galaxy from the humans. They were protecting the galaxy from the truth. The truth that the species they had tried to erase had built something so good that the act of witnessing it made everything outside the boundary feel thin and gray and insufficient. The truth that no one ever came back, not because they were captured or killed or imprisoned, but because they walked through a one-way door into a place where someone had figured out how to make kindness load-bearing, how to build warmth into the walls, how to turn the worst thing that ever happened to a species into the foundation of something the rest of the galaxy could not even imagine. The truth that the fire the conclave was so afraid of was not destructive. The only warm thing in a cold universe, and everyone who found it stayed by the flames. The boundary hummed. It had been humming for 3,000 years, a quiet, patient vibration at the edge of human space, and it would hum for 3,000 more, because the humans were not in a hurry, and had never been in a hurry, and understood with the deep, calm certainty of a species that had survived extinction and rebuilt reality, that the galaxy would come to them eventually. Not in war, not in conquest, one ship at a time, crossing an invisible line, expecting danger, finding something worse than danger, finding a home. And choosing, every single time, without coercion, without a single soul dragged or forced or tricked, choosing to stay. The door stayed open, the light stayed on, and the galaxy, vast and afraid and guilty, kept its distance from the only place in the universe where it would not have to be any of those things. For now, the humans could wait. They had gotten very good at it.